Julian walked into our Seattle penthouse smelling like sea salt and betrayal, convinced his 10-day digital detox lie was perfect. He hugged me, bragging about meditation and mountain air, while I stared at the turquoise Hermes scarf I had just pulled from his secret luggage compartment. He thought he was returning to a devoted wife. But when I quietly asked why her scarf was in his bag, the silence that followed shattered his entire world. My name is Elena, and I have always prided myself on being the architect of my own life, capable of designing structures that could withstand any tremor. But as Julian walked through the double doors of our Seattle penthouse, I realized I was about to demolish the very foundation I had spent the last 12 years reinforcing. He breezed in like a gust of warm wind, dropping his leather weekender bag on the entryway bench with a careless thud that echoed through the hallway. He looked radiant. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the spiritual, cleansed radiance of someone who had spent 10 days meditating in a rustic cabin in the Montana mountains, but the gluttonous, satisfied glow of a man who had been indulging every vice under the tropical sun. He pulled me into a hug, his arms squeezing tight, and buried his face in my neck. I held my breath, stiffening instinctively. I expected the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and perhaps the stale musk of a wood-burning stove. Instead, my nose was assaulted by the undeniable tang of sea salt, coconut sunscreen, and the distinct, humid cling of an ocean breeze. Elena, my God, I feel incredible, he exhaled, pulling back to look at me with eyes that sparkled with deceit. You were right. I needed this. 10 days. Just me, the silence, and my thoughts. No emails, no investors, no noise. I feel like a completely new man. He walked past me into the living room, unbuttoning his linen shirt, a garment that was far too crisp for a rugged retreat, and tossing it onto the sofa. I followed him silently, picking up the shirt. I folded it with mechanical precision, smoothing out the non-existent wrinkles, playing the role he expected the supportive, doting wife, the woman who kept his chaotic genius organized. The meditation sessions were brutal at first, he continued, his voice booming through the high-ceilinged room, oblivious to the oppressive quiet that hung over the rest of the house. But by day 3, I broke through. I wish you could have seen the sunrise over the peaks. It was spiritual. I feel recharged, ready to crush this IPO. I watched him move toward the kitchen island. He was moving with a lightness that annoyed me. He did not notice that the house was devoid of fresh flowers. He did not notice that I had not asked a single question about his therapy sessions or the vegan diet he claimed to be following. He was so drunk on his own lie that he thought he was invincible. While he poured himself a glass of water from the filtration system, I walked over to his carry-on bag still sitting by the door. My movements were fluid and practiced. I knew this bag better than he did. I had bought it for him 3 Christmases ago. I knew about the hidden zipper lining the inner pocket, the one designed for passports or emergency cash. My heart did not race. My hands did not tremble. A cold, clinical detachment had taken over my nervous system. I unzipped the main compartment, pushing aside a pile of swim trunks he had poorly attempted to hide under a thick sweater. I reached into the secret lining. My fingers brushed against something soft, cool, and undeniably expensive. I pulled it out. It was a scarf. A vintage Hermes silk scarf in a vibrant, piercing shade of turquoise. It slid through my fingers like liquid water. As I lifted it to the light, the scent hit me, not the ocean this time, but something far more specific. Le Labo Santal 33. It was a sharp, woody, unisex fragrance that was trendy among the tech elite. It was also a scent I famously detested, and certainly not one I wore. Julian was standing by the kitchen island, the glass raised to his lips, his head tilted back as he drank. He lowered the glass, turning around with that self-satisfied grin still plastered on his tanned face. You know, I was thinking we should... His voice died in his throat. I stood there in the middle of the living room, the turquoise silk draped casually over my hand like a weapon of war. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply ran my thumb over the hand-rolled hem of the fabric, studying the intricate pattern as if inspecting a flaw in a blueprint. I looked up, locking my eyes onto his. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked into the vacuum of his sudden panic. "Why was her scarf in your luggage? Julian," I asked. My voice was soft. It was the kind of tone one uses to ask about the weather or a dinner reservation. But the weight of the words crashed into him with the force of a freight train. The glass slipped from his hand. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling end over end until it hit the wide plank oak floor. The sound of shattering glass was violent and sharp, echoing off the minimalist walls. Water splashed across his expensive loafers and darkened the wood, but he did not move. He did not look down. He could not look away from the scarf. The flush of his sun-drenched skin drained away instantly, leaving him a sickly, ash-gray color. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. I did not give him a second to invent a new lie. I did not wait for the stammering denial that I knew was forming on his tongue. I just stood there and offered him a small, freezing smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered its prey and realized the hunt was going to be far easier and far more brutal than anticipated. To understand why that shattering glass sounded like the end of the world, you have to understand where we began. My mind instantly rewound 12 years, transporting me back to a dimly lit jazz bar in Chicago where the air smelled of stale beer and saxophone music. I was 24 then, a young architect with eyes full of skylines and steel structures. Julian was just a boy in a frayed hoodie, nursing a drink he could barely afford. But when he spoke about the future, he did not just see tomorrow, he saw the next century. Our romance was not written in expensive dinners or diamond jewelry. It was forged in the quiet, desperate hours between midnight and dawn in a cramped studio apartment that smelled constantly of pepperoni pizza and overheating hard drives. We were partners in the truest sense. While he wrote the code that would eventually become the backbone of Vertex, I designed the life that sustained him. I remember nights when we were so broke that we shared a single $5 meal, laughing about how one day we would own the city. The defining moment of our union happened 2 years in. I had received a prestigious offer from a boutique architecture firm in Paris. It was the career break I had worked for my entire life. But Vertex was floundering, bleeding cash and desperate for capital. I looked at the plane ticket, and then I looked at Julian, who was slumped over his keyboard, exhausted but brilliant. I made my choice. I turned down Paris. I emptied my entire savings account money meant for a down payment on a condo and funneled every cent into keeping his servers running. I bet everything on him. I remember his 27th birthday vividly. We could not afford a real cake, so I stuck a single candle into a glazed donut. Under the flickering yellow light, Julian took my hands, his eyes wet with gratitude. He told me that I was the permanent shareholder of his life. He swore that no matter how high he climbed, I would always be the ground beneath his feet. That promise was the mortar that held us together through the lean years. When Vertex finally exploded into the tech giant it is today, we moved to Seattle. We bought the penthouse. We entered a world of private jets and exclusive clubs. But as our bank account balance grew, the man I loved began to fade. The hoodies were replaced by $5,000 bespoke suits. The intimate movie nights were cannibalized by endless charity galas where I was expected to stand by his side, looking elegant and saying nothing of substance. I adapted, because that is what I do. I managed our personal assets, handled the contractors, and smoothed over his social blunders. I remained the silent engine room while he stood on the deck, basking in the applause of the world. We had finally agreed to start a family this year, after 5 years of him telling me to wait until the next product launch or the next fiscal quarter. He had finally agreed. The nursery was already designed in my head, a sanctuary of soft light and hope, but a woman knows. The intuition of a wife who has weathered a decade with a man is sharper than any surveillance system. I had felt the temperature drop long before he left for his trip. It was in the way he looked at me across the dinner table. The adoration that used to define his gaze had curdled into something else. He looked at me with tolerance, like I was an old, comfortable piece of furniture that no longer fit the modern aesthetic of his life. I saw the patience in his eyes, the kind of politeness one shows to a guest they secretly wish would leave. I knew the foundation was cracking, but I never imagined he had already moved out. The cracks in our marriage did not appear overnight. They were chiseled in slowly, day by day, by a new presence in Julian's life. Her name was Vanessa, the newly appointed director of investor relations at Vertex. She was 28 years old, a Wharton graduate with a shark's instinct and a runway model's wardrobe. I met her once at a company gala, and she looked at me with the polite disinterest of someone assessing a depreciating asset. At first, Julian mentioned her only in passing. He praised her efficiency and her ability to charm the hardened venture capitalists. But soon, her name became a staple of our dinner conversations. The praise morphed into subtle comparisons that stung more than direct insults. He would look at my linen dress and muse aloud about how Vanessa had such a bold, modern aesthetic that really resonated with the new market. He never explicitly called me old-fashioned, but the implication hung heavy in the air. I was the classic architecture he had outgrown, and she was the gleaming glass skyscraper he wanted to inhabit. Then came the secrecy. For 12 years, we had an open phone policy. But suddenly, Julian's phone was always face down on the marble countertop. His passcode changed. When I asked him about it, he mumbled something about new security protocols required by the board. His business trips became more frequent and vague. He was always scouting locations or courting investors in cities that happened to have excellent nightlife. I watched him drift away, retreating behind a wall of silence and passwords. The climax of this distancing act was his sudden announcement that he needed a break. He told me he had booked a 10-day stay at an exclusive digital detox retreat deep in the mountains of Montana. I need to find my center again. Elena, he said, looking at me with practiced earnestness. Before the IPO madness starts, I need total silence. No signal, no internet, just meditation and nature. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe that my husband was just stressed and not straying. I played the part of the dutiful wife, helping him pack thermal layers and hiking boots, folding his wool socks while my stomach churned with anxiety. I was trying to silence the screaming voice in my head that said, men who love the limelight do not suddenly crave 10 days of isolation. The morning he left, the air between us was brittle. Before we headed to the airport, Julian pulled a document out of his briefcase. It was a power of attorney form. We were in the middle of a minor real estate acquisition for a vacation plot, and he claimed he would be unreachable to sign the closing papers. I trust you with everything, L, he said as he signed the bottom line, handing over full legal authority to me for the duration of his trip. You handle it. You always know what to do. I took the paper, staring at his signature. It felt like a peace offering, a tangible proof of his faith in me. I drove him to the airport, desperate for that faith to be real, at the drop-off curb. He kissed me, but his eyes were not on mine. They were darting around, scanning the terminal, looking past me. I will come back a better husband, he promised, his voice hollow. I just need this time. I watched him walk through the sliding glass doors of the terminal. He did not look back once, and in that moment, as his figure disappeared into the crowd, a cold realization washed over me. It started at the base of my neck and froze my entire spine. My intuition, which I had suppressed for months, finally broke through the denial. He was not going to Montana. There were no mountains in his future. I drove back to our empty penthouse in silence. When I stepped into the living room, the space felt vast and mocking. I looked at the spot where he had stood, lying to my face. I realized then that if I continued to sit and wait, I would be the victim of this story. I decided I was done waiting. I was done being the trusting wife who looked the other way. I set my keys on the counter and prepared to tear his lie apart, piece by piece. 2 days after Julian left for his phantom retreat, the silence in the penthouse became suffocating. I was pacing the living room, trying to distract myself with cleaning, when the nozzle of the vacuum cleaner hit something hard, wedged deep beneath the low-slung Italian sofa. I reached into the darkness and pulled out Julian's old iPad Pro. It was the one with the cracked screen corner that he had tossed aside months ago, claiming the processor was fried and the device was useless. I stared at the dusty screen. On a sudden impulse, driven by a gnawing restlessness I could not name, I carried it to the kitchen island and plugged it into the charger. I expected nothing. I expected a dead battery or a glitching operating system. Instead, the Apple logo appeared, bright and steady. He had not wiped it. He had simply discarded it, arrogant in his belief that I would never touch his discarded tech. The moment the device powered on, it automatically connected to our home Wi-Fi network. Then came the sounds. Ping, ping, ping. The device began to frantically synchronize, downloading weeks of data that had been backed up to the cloud from his current phone. I watched as the Photos app updated, the numbers climbing rapidly. I tapped the icon, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was expecting to see boring shots of pine trees, meditation cushions, or perhaps a rustic cabin interior in Montana. Instead, my screen was flooded with the blinding blue of the ocean. The location tag at the top of the album read, Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. I swiped through the images, my breath catching in my throat. There was Julian, shirtless and tanned, holding a glass of champagne on the deck of a private yacht. And there, wrapped around him like a vine, was Vanessa. She was wearing a white string bikini, her head thrown back in laughter, looking at the camera with triumphant possession. There were photos of them sunbathing at a 5-star resort, eating lobster by the water, and walking hand in hand on the beach at sunset. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the tablet, but I forced myself to open the Messages app. The conversation with V was at the very top. Reading their exchange was like drinking broken glass. To my freedom, she had texted him, captioning a selfie of them in the first-class lounge. To the future, Julian had replied. I scrolled back, my eyes scanning the texts for keywords. The cruelty was systematic. Julian had laid out a cold, calculated timeline. He promised her that as soon as the IPO was finalized and the lockup period ended, he would file for divorce. He explicitly wrote that he could not leave me yet because a messy separation would spook the board and tank the stock price. I was not a wife to him. I was a liability to be managed, but the financial calculation was not the worst part. It was the mockery. I found a text from the morning he left. Vanessa had asked, "Is the old architect crying about your mental health?" Followed by a laughing emoji. Julian's response was immediate. She is packing my wool socks right now. She has no clue. It is pathetic how easy this is to play her. Pathetic. That was the word he used to describe 12 years of my devotion. I kept digging. I opened his calendar and saw the entry for today, 6-month anniversary dinner at Sunset Mona Lisa. They were not just having a fling, they were celebrating half a year of deception. This digital detox was actually their early honeymoon. Then I checked the banking app, which was also still logged in. I gasped aloud. There was a withdrawal from our joint emergency savings account made 3 days ago, $200,000. The transaction code was vague, but a quick search in his synced email trash folder revealed the truth. He had bought a diamond necklace from Cartier and paid for a 10-day charter of a luxury yacht. He was burning through our life savings to impress his mistress. I felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a flash of blinding white-hot rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the iPad against the marble counter. But then, just as quickly as the fire ignited, it was extinguished by a sheet of ice. The crying woman died in that moment. The architect took over. I did not smash the device. I did not call him. Instead, I went to work. I took screenshots of every text, every incriminating photo, and every timestamp. I downloaded the hotel invoices, the jewelry receipts, and the flight manifests. I exported the entire chat history and saved it to an encrypted external drive. I sat there for hours, methodically building a dossier of evidence that was legally bulletproof. By the time I finished, I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter who had just been handed the ultimate weapon, and I was going to make sure he did not survive the shot. Just as I was finishing the financial slaughter, my private investigator emailed me the final dossier on Vanessa. The report was the cherry on top of this toxic sundae. It turned out that Julian was not the only one being played. Vanessa was sleeping with the chief financial officer of Vertex, a man twice her age who held a seat on the board. She was hedging her bets, securing her position from both the founder and the money man. Julian destroyed his marriage for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a stepping stone. I printed the email chain proving Vanessa's double infidelity. I placed it in a neat folder next to the transfer confirmation from Orion and the sale agreement for the penthouse. Every move was calculated, every angle was covered. I had dismantled his life with the same precision I used to design skyscrapers. When the last document was filed, I sat back in the leather chair in the living room. The house was quiet. The rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of Seattle. I placed the used power of attorney document in the center of the coffee table, right where he would see it. I was no longer the grieving daughter or the betrayed wife. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and I was simply waiting for the defendant to walk through the door. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of water dripping from the kitchen island onto the hardwood floor. Julian stared at the turquoise scarf in my hand, his eyes darting back and forth as his brain scrambled to construct a plausible defense. He cleared his throat, a nervous cracking sound that betrayed his desperation. "Elena, listen," he stammered, taking a tentative step toward me, crunching a shard of glass under his shoe. "I know how this looks, but that is for you. I bought it at the duty-free shop on the way back. I wanted to surprise you, but I was so exhausted from the retreat that I forgot to have it wrapped." I looked at him, and then I looked down at the silk. A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "For me. Since when do I wear bright turquoise, and more importantly, Julian? Since when do my initials stand for Vanessa Moore?" I flipped the corner of the scarf over, revealing the monogram embroidered in gold thread, VM. Julian froze. The color that had drained from his face earlier did not return. Instead, beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He realized, finally, that this was not a misunderstanding he could charm his way out of. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the iPad. It was still active, the slideshow of his detox playing in a loop. I tossed it onto the sofa next to him. It landed with a soft thud, screen up, displaying a picture of him and Vanessa toasting with margaritas. "Your digital detox in Mexico looked very therapeutic," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Did the tequila help you find your center? Or was it the $200,000 you stole from our savings to pay for the yacht?" Julian collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The facade of the confident CEO crumbled instantly. He began to sob, a pathetic, heaving sound. "I am sorry, Elena. Please. It meant nothing. It was just the pressure. The IPO is driving me insane. Vanessa was there, and she understood the stress. It was a mistake. I love you. I have never stopped loving you." I watched him cry. I waited until his sobs subsided into sniffles, and then I delivered the blow that I knew would destroy him. "You love me?" I asked quietly. "Is that why you ignored me when I needed you most?" He looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "What do you mean?" "While you were busy loving me from a yacht in Cabo," I said, enunciating every word with surgical precision. "My father died." The shock on his face was genuine. His jaw dropped. What? No. Elena. Oh my God. I did not know. I swear I did not know. You never called me. I did not call because you blocked my number. I cut him off. But I messaged your secret phone, the one you are hiding in your pocket right now. I texted you that he was dying. I begged you to call. I missed it. He lied, his voice shaking. I must have missed it. Do not lie to me, I shouted, the first time my voice raised in anger. I saw the receipt. Julian. It said read. You looked at that message. You saw that my father, the man who treated you like a son, was taking his last breath, and you put the phone down and ordered another round of drinks. He flinched as if I had struck him. I was scared, he whispered. I did not know what to do. I am so sorry. I will make it up to you. I swear. I will cut Vanessa off today. I will fire her. She means nothing to me. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt, looking at him with nothing but pity and disgust. You do not need to bother firing her, Julian, I said, walking toward the hallway to retrieve my coat. She is not going to be your problem for much longer. In fact, she is probably already packing her things. He looked at me, confusion clouding his panic. What are you talking about? I smiled, but it did not reach my eyes. You really have no idea what I have done in the last 10 days. Do you? Julian stood there, blinking rapidly, unable to process the shift in the atmosphere. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he did not speak. I did not offer an explanation. Instead, I reached for the second document I had prepared, a thick sheaf of papers clipped together with a heavy steel binder, and held it out to him. He took it with a trembling hand, his eyes locking onto the legal letterhead at the top of the page. Do you remember that power of attorney you signed at the airport? I asked, my voice deceptively light, almost conversational. You were so eager to get to your mistress that you did not bother reading the fine print. You gave me total, unrestricted control over your assets. Julian, and I want to thank you for trusting me to handle your portfolio. He ripped the envelope open, the sound of tearing paper echoing sharply in the silent room. As he scanned the first page, his knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of the leather sofa to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. He was reading the confirmation of the stock transfer. He was reading the death certificate of his career. You sold my shares, he whispered, the volume rising with every word until he was screaming. You sold my controlling stake to Orion. Are you insane? That is my company. He looked up, his face twisted in a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. He took a step toward me, his hands balled into fists, looking ready to physically strike me for the first time in our marriage. But I did not flinch. I stood my ground, staring him down with such cold intensity that he froze mid-step. It was not your company, I corrected him calmly. It was our company. We built it on my savings, my sweat, and my sacrifice. I simply liquidated my portion of the investment, plus interest for the 12 years of my life I wasted on building your ego. Before he could scream again, a cacophony erupted from the floor. His phone, which had been silent, suddenly began to vibrate and ring violently. It was not just a call, it was an avalanche. The screen lit up with names that made his blood run cold: the chairman of the board, the lead investor from Sequoia, the head of legal counsel. The news of the hostile takeover had just hit the wire. The market was reacting, and the board was panicking. You ruined me, he gasped, watching the phone dance across the floorboards. I am not finished, I said. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and tapped the screen once. I just sent a very interesting email to the Vertex Ethics Committee. It contains every photo, every text, and every receipt from your little getaway in Cabo. Oh, and I copied Vanessa's fiancé. Did you know she was engaged to a hedge fund manager in New York? My private investigator found him quite easily. Julian scrambled for his phone, ignoring the calls from the billionaires trying to save their investment. He opened his messages. His face went slack. his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "You told him," he choked out. "Read the text from her. Julian." I commanded. He looked down. I knew exactly what it said because my investigator had forwarded it to me the moment it was sent. Vanessa had seen the news about the stock transfer and received the proof of the affair simultaneously. She was a survivor, and she knew when to cut dead weight. "You bastard," he read aloud, his voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. "You lost everything. Do not ever contact me again." The phone slipped from his fingers for the second time that day. In the span of 60 minutes, the great Julian Vance had lost his wife, his company, his fortune, his mistress, and his reputation. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the life he had built were closing in. He sank to the floor, sitting amidst the shards of the broken water glass, heedless of the sharp edges pressing into his expensive bespoke suit. He looked small. He looked like a child who had been caught stealing and had his favorite toy taken away forever. I walked back to the coffee table one last time, beside the turquoise Hermes scarf, which now looked like nothing more than a crumpled rag. I placed a thick manila envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, already signed, notarized, and filed. The ink on my signature was dry, final, and absolute. "This penthouse is sold," I informed him, my voice echoing off the high ceilings that used to make me feel proud, but now just felt cavernous. The closing documents were signed yesterday morning. The new owner takes possession next Friday. That gives you exactly 7 days to pack up whatever is left of your ego and get out. Julian looked up at me, his face a mask of sheer terror. The arrogance that had defined him for the last 5 years had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell. He scrambled to his knees, reaching out as if to grab the hem of my skirt, but stopped short when he saw the look in my eyes. "Elena, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "You stripped me of everything, my company, my money, my home. This is murder without a knife." "No." "Julian," I replied, looking down at him without a shred of empathy. "This is not murder. This is justice. You chose to leave reality behind to live in a fantasy with a 28-year-old social climber. You wanted a new life. Remember, you wanted freedom. Well, here it is. Enjoy your new reality." I turned my back on him and walked to the entryway where my suitcase was waiting. I had packed it hours before he even landed, filled with only the essentials. I left behind the designer clothes, the jewelry he had bought me out of guilt, and the furniture we had chosen together. I wanted none of it. I wanted to walk out of there with nothing that carried his fingerprint. My hand hovered over the brass door handle. I paused and looked back at him one last time. He was still on the floor, staring at the scarf as if it were a holy relic of a lost civilization. "Oh, and that scarf," I said, my voice light and airy. "I washed it before you came in. I used bleach. It is ruined, just like I have scrubbed you out of my life." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving as a guttural wail tore from his throat. It was the sound of a man realizing he was truly alone. I did not stay to watch. I stepped out into the corridor and pulled the heavy door shut, the latch clicking into place with a satisfying finality, cutting off the sound of his crying. The silence in the elevator as I descended 40 floors was profound. I watched the numbers on the display count down, and with every passing floor, I felt lighter. The suffocation I had lived with for months was gone. It was as if 1,000 pounds of concrete had been lifted from my chest. When I walked out of the lobby, the Seattle sky was gray and weeping. A light drizzle was falling, the kind that usually made the city feel gloomy and oppressive. But today, as the cool drops hit my face, mixing with the dry air, it felt like a baptism. It was washing away the toxicity, the lies, and the woman I used to be. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only number that mattered now. "It is done," I said when she answered, my voice steady and strong. I am coming home. It has been exactly 6 months since I left Seattle. I traded the gray, weeping skies of the Pacific Northwest for the golden, relentless heat of Austin, Texas. My new architecture firm is small, housed in a renovated warehouse district that smells of roasted coffee and ambition. It is a long way from the glass tower penthouse, and that is exactly how I like it. As for Julian, the Grapevine is a very efficient information network. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the board fired him less than 48 hours after I left. Without his controlling shares, he was defenseless against the hostile takeover. He is currently entangled in half a dozen lawsuits regarding financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty. The last I heard, he was living in a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, driving a cheap leased sedan and aging rapidly. The stress has taken the hair he was so vain about, and the investors he used to charm now refuse to take his calls. Vanessa fared no better. Her engagement ended before the wedding invitations were even mailed. Her fiancé, the hedge fund manager, did not appreciate being made a fool of publicly. She was blacklisted from the investment banking world for ethical violations and has quietly disappeared from the socialite pages. They destroyed themselves. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the wreckage. I did not keep the money from the sale of my shares. It felt dirty to spend it on personal luxury. Instead, I established a charitable foundation in my father's name. We provide seed funding and mentorship for female-led technology startups, giving women the support I gave Julian, but without the risk of betrayal. Every time I sign a grant check, I feel a little bit of my father's spirit standing beside me. The pain of losing him is still a dull ache in my chest, a void that will never truly be filled. But I know he would be proud. He raised a fighter, and I finally proved it to him. I am not in a rush to fill the empty space in my bed. For the first time in 12 years, I am learning to enjoy my own company. I cook dinner for one without feeling lonely. I take long walks along the Colorado River without checking my phone. I am falling in love with the woman in the mirror, the one I neglected for so long while I was busy polishing Julian's armor. Yesterday afternoon, a notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was an email from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made my heart stop for a split second. It said simply, "I am sorry." It was a long, rambling letter from Julian. He wrote about his regrets, his misery, and his delusional hope that we could perhaps meet for coffee and start over. He said he had changed. He said he missed his architect. I sat there with my hand on the mouse, reading his words. I waited for the anger to return. I waited for the sadness, or even a spark of satisfaction. But there was nowhere to go. Just a vast, cool indifference. He was a stranger to me now, a character from a book I had finished reading a long time ago. I did not reply. I moved the cursor to the trash icon, selected Delete Forever, and then blocked the sender. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of hygiene. I stood up and walked to the window. The Austin skyline was blazing in the sunset, a canvas of burnt orange and violet. The air conditioning hummed softly, a sound of modern comfort. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of a life that belonged entirely to me. My life is not a fairy tale. There are scars, and there are losses that will never heal. But as I looked out at the horizon, I smiled. The pen is in my hand now, and for the first time, I am the only one writing the next chapter. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.